Welcome back to Sales Insights with Sarah. This is the podcast for sales professionals and business leaders looking to implement new strategies and drive sales growth in their organizations. I'm your host, Sarah Downs, and my guests and I will be sharing with you some of our own experiences in business and sales insights to help you gain focus and take action. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Sales Insights with Sarah podcast. So today I am delighted to have a guest with me, Andrea Petrone, who has kindly joined me from London. That's the great thing about doing this on Zoom, is we can speak to people all around the world, no problem, on a Friday afternoon. So welcome, Andrea. How are you today?
Thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure being with you. I'm fantastic. Thank you for asking.
So today we're going to be talking about leadership, sales leadership in particular, and how as sales leaders, we need to think about getting the most out of our teams. So talking about high performing sales teams, which is going to be a really interesting conversation for all the leaders that are listening to this, but also all the people within those teams that are maybe looking to progress in an organization into more management leadership positions, and also just to see what their own leaders could be doing better to support them, I guess.
Absolutely right. That's exactly what we'll love to talk with you and with your audience, because that's super important nowadays.
Absolutely. And we haven't actually had an interview on the podcast yet, specifically focused in this area. And it's been one I've been wanting to do for a while, but I've been waiting for the right person to come along. So just a bit of background, we actually met on Clubhouse. It was a bit of a chance encounter meeting where I was invited up to your stage, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
And we realized we had a lot in common with the industries that we worked in, companies we've worked with, specifically in the more oil and gas and energy side, and just started talking and realized that we really did align on a number of different topics and also, I guess, values. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you. And actually, there is 100% agreed. And there is actually a lesson on that, because from a sales perspective, actually, is the fact that you never know who is in the audience, right? And that actually happens when you attend events. Clubhouse is just, social online events. But in reality, it's just, it's a combination of a number of events happening at the same time. And that's exactly what it's all about. You never know who's in the audience. So you need to be careful and ready and prepared to, not only with your pitch, but, to say exactly what you want to the audience understand from you. So I don't think it's a coincidence that we met, by the way. So
I'm glad we did. And I'm glad one of your co-mods had invited me up when I joined the room. So thanks to him, I guess, that we got to meet. And for my follow-up, I must say, I was persistent with the follow-up to make sure we had a conversation.
Exactly right. And the other thing, you have done your follow-up very quickly, actually. That was the same day or the day after. That means that not only that you really wanted to have this follow-up, but also it was easy for me to remember the conversation well, because actually that room was very big, was very large. And again, it seemed like live events, right? When you meet hundreds of people at the same time, and then you have all this bunch of business cards, and then you're like, oh gosh, what should I do now? I forgot what is the follow-up action I need to do it. So I always say, write something on a business card, as long as it's not black. That's the only problem. But absolutely right. So you did everything right.
Great. So obviously you have had 20 plus years experience, Andrea, in, I guess, that more executive positions in different companies, different countries all around the world. You're very well traveled. So it would be great if you could just share, for those listening that don't yet know you, just a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, sure, Sarah. So I had this opportunity to, as many in our industry, right, to work from essentially day one abroad, so with an international assignment. So I started my career in Saipem, so in one of the major EPC contractor, and in very few months, then I started to my first assignment. I was actually in Equatorial Guinea, so West Africa. At that time, there was nothing there, literally nothing. and just a number of mosquitoes and the client. It was a British gas at the time. So I went there as a trainee, working with another leader on managing one of the major contracts there at that time. But after that, really, as you can imagine, as you probably know, and most of the people anyway in the audience, they understand very well, the oil industry also offers a number of incredible career opportunities, sometimes, very unexpected. So I had an incredible career progression since that time. So in only 4 years, I became a project leader in Egypt, so in other different locations. So I started to manage a number of different drilling rigs at the time. And so everything actually went super well, and probably even too fast, because, you want to really understand and mastering the skills. But I think that the positive thing is you learn so many things because you live in a very challenging context, culturally, professionally, but also in terms of leadership, because you need to learn, for example, how to manage people. And we're talking about large teams, for example, on board of drilling rigs or platforms in a very, like this, but you need to be ready. So as you can imagine, you learn a lot by doing and not actually by reading books, but that's for another conversation, how to learn. However, that has been my story. And then I moved back to Italy, which is of course, my original country. And I worked for another organization that was actually growing like crazy. At that time, the oil price was very high. So I think it was perfect opportunity for me to make an impact. And actually I did. So I've been there for other 4 years. I became managing director of one of the branches of this large organization. So the career really went very well, really, I have to say that. But it was something that was missing at that time, was missing the international exposure. So because I love the international experience I had before. And for me, going back to my own country, although it was good from a personal perspective, but I realized I was not maybe too big for my professional development. So I felt I wasn't there yet where I wanted to be. And then I went back to international assignments. I went to Norway. I managed for another organization all the development for the North Sea country. And that was the time when I came across with an opportunity, actually in the UK, in London, where I'm right now, in a consulting business, but still in the oil and gas industry. And I've been there for many years. I led the consulting team, and it's been an amazing experience. But that was not enough for me. So I wanted to really focus more on my leadership, but also on developing leadership for other people, for other organizations. So that's the reason why I decided to certify as an executive coach in Florida. And since then, I started to work with both individuals and organizations, primarily in the oil industry, and helping them to develop the leadership. And certainly what I learned from this experience is this industry is facing a number of challenges. And I mean, it's been always like that, right? Because it is a typical industry, has, peaks and valleys all over the time. But now we are facing one very specific challenge, which is really clearly the oil price not going up anymore where it used to be, but also all the energy transition. So, and that requires a completely different leadership, different organizational structure, different view for talent development, for hiring, attracting. So in other words, the people side. And that's why my focus right now. I hope that helps.
No, that's great. And it's something you said during that introduction about, managing teams that all around the world. And I think, there'll be people listening to this that are not familiar with oil and energy as well. And I can just imagine you, on an aspect, you're speaking about the drilling side. And even though you could be in, I don't know, the Middle East, you could have people there from all around the world. So you've got different cultures, different languages, different ways of working, all coming together. It must have been very difficult to manage, that forever changing and very dynamic team.
Is absolutely right. You're totally right, Sarah. I think the international exposure the organization has requires actually a really understanding of different cultures. And I think I had this pleasure, this opportunity to work really across different countries with, of course, with international teams. And what really I learned is the more you know your people, the more you know your team, in particular, actually, if you're in sales team, because I manage as well a large sales team in my corporate experience, the better really is the outcome. Because, you know, there is one principle about influence, and when we talk about sales or managing a team, we're talking about essentially influence. And there is the one principle about influence is you really need to, you can influence one team at the same time. The real influence happens one person at a time. But in order to do that, you really need to know inside out your people. And I think that's something that sometimes, unfortunately, the leaders, they don't really understand that, because they believe, you know, well, I have a team of 10 or 20 or 40. I need to deliver a message, you know, across all the team. Although that is right, but that's not the best way to build influence. So if you really want to mobilize people, mobilize teams, unfortunately, there is hard work to do. It's really knowing people one by one, understanding what are the real motivations, what are the drivers, what is the purpose of every single people. And you are into the space, understanding people as well. So you know how critical it is that when it comes to managing a team.
Yeah, you're making me smile. I don't know if I told you yet, but I had a meeting with a sales leader a few weeks ago, and they had 8 salespeople.
Okay.
And I asked the question of, you know, what motivates John? His name was, but having issues with this individual. And he said, just bear with me a moment, and pulled up an Excel file where there was a list of motivation, which was things such as career progression, you know, just not really what we talk about with motivation. And he had to pull up an Excel file because the only time that person had been asked was during their annual appraisal. And I said, well, there's your problem. You know, you need to understand your people. You need to get to know your people, at least make the effort to, you know, some people might not give much away, but at least asking the questions. And that has to be done on a regular basis, because their motivations and what matters to them and what they care about could change as well. You know, just because you asked them 3 years ago doesn't mean the answer would be the same today. So you were making me smile because I was just remembering that meeting. And if the individuals listening, they won't mind, I'm sure. We had a bit of a laugh about it afterwards, but it's very real, and it's something that's really overlooked in leadership, you know, really getting to know your people, and not just where they want to climb that corporate ladder, but actually what drives them, what gets them excited, what they care about.
He's absolutely right. So there are a couple of things that you said are super relevant. So one is the fact that even annual performance reviews are not enough at all to understand what's going on with your team. That's the first thing. So you really need to have multiple touch points with your people. I'm not saying weekly, but it doesn't matter the frequency itself. What is important is having that regular and frequent touch point, understanding what's going on. Because as you said, motivation change for a number of reasons, but also in the way how the leaders behave. Because we have to remember this. As a leader, you are watched 100% of the time. Yeah. How you move, how you talk, how you behave, in a number of ways, a number of channels. And whatever you do, make an impact on other people on your team. And if you don't understand what's going on in their life, in their world, you really miss some important things. And also motivation, you know, there are, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, right? And the intrinsic motivation are the real driver for mobilizing people. And maybe we can talk a little bit later. I don't know whether it's going to be or not into the conversation, but you talk about whether money or not is the motivation, and actually it's not. So it's really understanding what are intrinsic motivation, what really mobilize people. And that is important as well in sales.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of leaders, not necessarily sales leaders, but business leaders, make that assumption that salespeople are extrinsically motivated by money, material things, where most of them, like you said, are intrinsic. You know, they care about, you know, way more than that, which we can maybe deep dive into later. So on that note, and getting to know people, I know that you recently studied neuroscience. So what was it that made you take that step, I guess, next step, to really understand people better?
Yeah, I'm glad actually you brought this up, because I've been always fascinated about the brain works. I think as many of us, right? But then I thought, how much really is relevant, is important, understanding that from a leadership, but more importantly, from a performance perspective. So I decided to go through this certification. Now I have it, so I can actually even apply all the principles of neuroscience into my current program services that I already offered to to the organization, to the individuals. And what I think really surprised me is how important actually is understanding how the brain works from a motivational perspective. That's exactly the point you are making. Because I mean, without entering into the details, that's not either the point nor the space. But what really I learned is the fact that you can do a lot of things just working on releasing some specific neurochemicals that really help people to improve their motivation, their joy, their stamina, as they say, but also to release maybe more stress, to have a better lifestyle. Because actually, when we talk about teams in a very competitive environment, as is sales environments, you need to make sure that you have this incredible peak of dopamine, which is one of the neurochemical that really help you for motivation, for get the things done, to get to the next level of clients, of sales, et cetera, et cetera. But you still need to have, that moment to let your body reflect, release, regenerate, and that is super important. So if you understand these dynamics, it's super actually important, not only for the well-being at all, actually, to move people or teams from standard average performance actually to a higher level of performance, but also more sustainable along the way. And if you're a sales leader, for example, that's the only thing that you really need. Peak performance, but sustainable all over the time. Because otherwise you have a peak performance one day, and then maybe you have a week of terrible days because maybe you got to know from a client, right? So that is super important. And that's when neuroscience potentially kicks in.
Yeah, and that sustainability is something that, people are always looking at, because sometimes we understand how to get those quick wins and spike that revenue curve. But it's then how do we retain our margins and have that sustainability in the organization as well, and how can leaders trust that and have confidence in that? And obviously it needs to be evidenced that it's going to be sustainable. So how can sales leaders, I guess, boost dopamine in a team? Can you give any examples?
Yeah, so there are many ways to boost dopamine. So to increase, in other words, the level of energy, urgency in people. And I mean, one of the main areas is really back to what we're discussing so far, is actually increasing the level of motivation, right? Because there is a strong correlation between motivation and dopamine. And in order to increase the motivation, though, you need to understand really what is your purpose as a person, as a team, as an individuals. What is your drive? What is your level of resilience, which is certainly important nowadays, but actually it's been always important when you're leading an important role, like sales, for example, right? But also there are other two elements. They're very important. One is the level of autonomy. Mm-hmm. And the other one is actually the level of your skill set, how you master the skills. So these are the two important elements, if you think about, because as a sales leader, certainly you want to boost autonomy in your people. So if you start to micromanage people, that is the first example how you can actually kill the dopamine, kill the energy, kill the motivation. People that don't want to be micromanaged. So the level of autonomy has to be in place. And, I have seen this so many times in sales, but not only in sales, in many other leadership roles. All these leaders, they jump in, they micromanage, they show, you know what, stop what you're doing. Let me show you the way. Let me show you how to do a sales call. That's really killing everything when it comes to engagement, motivation, etc. It also is mastering the skills. I do believe that skills must be mastered. It's not just technical skills, of course. It's not how, leading a sales conversation, how to do a sales call, how writing a sales mail, which is equally important. But it's also all the other elements about leadership skills. So in other words, is how to communicate it. Back to my point, how to influence people, how to negotiate with people, but from a specific leadership skill perspective, not only from a tactical, I'm going to give you this, you're going to give me that. So that's a different thing. So learning, in other words, different leadership styles that allow you, influence that allow you actually to use different proposition, different way to communicate, to influence people based on the context. And that's interesting, sorry, because there's been a research that most of the people, unfortunately, use only one or two influence skills. So, the typical left brain. So if you're very left brain, you normally use fact, data, logics to convince someone. And if you are the right brain, you use metaphor, images, etc. Now, the neuroscience has changed a bit. This probably doesn't exist, the left and right brain, in the way how we describe it, but still, these two different elements, they're there. But there are other 5 different influence skills that people, they don't normally use. It's called heart skill, the spirit skill, the vision skill, the guts skill. So there are different levels of skill that you need to master in order to understand how to influence people in the right situation. So, of course, there is much more to say, but these are, I think, the major elements to boost dopamine, so motivation in people.
I love it. I could just listen to this stuff all day. Absorb. It's great. I'm sure people are learning a lot. So obviously you've been a manager in a number of different businesses, from small to very large global corporates, and in a number of different management roles as well. So what do you believe, Andrea, makes a great leader? Not necessarily in sales, but in general, what makes a great leader? And is there a difference in those smaller organizations versus those very large corporates?
This is such a great question. And so answering to the second question, no, I don't think there is a difference. I think leadership is defined by the behaviors that you have, and not necessarily in the context where you are. But back to the first question, I mean, there are a number of things. First and foremost, I think, is trust. And you mentioned this a little bit earlier. Without trust, there is no way you can lead an organization, you can lead a team. And actually, it's been studied that trust is the first element actually that turns normal organization, high-performing organization. And that is trust. So it's not anything else. It's just trust. Trust in your people, trust in your team, trust also the environment that you're building for your people. The second element that is super important as well is, what is called emotional intelligence. I mean, under emotional intelligence, are a number of different things, but in other words, emotional intelligence is having the empathy to understand someone else's position and what they are facing, what they're dealing with, and be ready really to help and support your people as much as you can. That's really emotional intelligence. Now, there are different, there are different leadership styles, but I don't believe it's the leadership style that make a difference, but actually these are the elements: trust, empathy, but also in particular emotional intelligence. And also, I think, is back to my point before, is the consistency that you have. The famous walk the talk. That's exactly what it's all about, because you are the message. You are the message. And as I said before, you are watched all over the time in your organization. People really study you as a leader. They see what you do. And you have a leadership role as well in your organization, Sarah. So I'm sure that you realize that every single step that you make is being, I'm not saying judged, but it's been certainly watched, it's being analyzed, with the eyes of someone else. So being such a consistent person and deliver a consistent message in an organization, it makes you better, stronger, more trustworthy, but at the end of the day, really a better leader. And of course, as a consequence of that, the better leader you are, the easier will be actually to empower others and to make sure that the people they follow, your direction, your vision as a leader. But that's, I think, it's more as a consequence if you have these things in place. Does it make sense?
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I just want to touch on empathy a little bit there. I've had a number of actually recent conversations around empathy. Do you believe that someone can have too much empathy or not strike the balance of understanding when to use empathy, and especially in a leadership or management kind of role where you're almost using empathy too much and therefore not making decisions that maybe need to be made because you're almost using empathy to make an excuse for potentially the employee, for example, for not performing, as an example?
Love this question. It's such a great question. Now, I would just make a little bit a little tweak on this. I don't believe is probably what we describe in this context is empathy, probably is more sociability. And I can tell you what's the impact of sociability, but that comes to empathy anyway. So that's not wrong, by the way. So that's the thing. If you're a leader with a high level of empathy and sociability, you certainly build an environment based on harmony. And it's not artificial harmony, which is great. So it's natural, pure, genuine harmony. That's what you're really looking for in a team. So that's fantastic. But there is a limit. So there is a really fine line on that, because if you are actually going over the line and you becoming too much social with your people, not social media, but social means really, I'm not saying you don't have to have drinks, for example, with your people. Yeah, exactly. Not to that point, but we have to remember that our people, the employees, the team, yes, they're looking for empathy. They're looking for harmony. They're looking for a fantastic place to work, but they're also looking for direction and clear instruction. And also clear career development plans for them. Let's face it, because that's what they're looking for. So I've seen, actually, I coach a client in Shell, by the way, in Houston, that we did an assessment at the beginning of this process. And when I asked her, what is your sociability level? She said, oh, I'm very good with people. People love me, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, she was right. But then when we asked, her teams about her leadership style and behaviors, you guess what happened? Some of them, they said, yeah, she's social, but that is too much for me. I wasn't looking for that. I was looking for actually, hey, these are my roles. These are my responsibilities. These are my goals. These are my vision. So sometimes if you fall into the high social element, you probably forget the people that are not looking for that certainly helps, but people that are looking for leaders, which is really different than that. So that does answer your question.
So, because we say empathy is really important in leadership, so that's why I wanted to touch on that, because I think there is a balance, and I think if you're a leader with a high level of empathy, you're right. That social side, it is really difficult, probably an internal fight, that these leaders are having with themselves on probably an hourly, daily basis. But I just wanted, and also on emotional intelligence, I'm just looking at my bookcase right now. Daniel Goleman,
who is the number one for emotional intelligence. Yes,
that book. I couldn't remember the surname, but it was a Daniel
Goleman.
Yeah, Goleman. There we go.
Goleman.
For anyone looking to read on emotional intelligence, and obviously empathy, trust, everything comes into that. That's a fantastic one. Is there any books that you recommend on that?
On books on emotional intelligence or on leadership in general?
I think both.
Okay. No, emotional intelligence, Dan Goleman, I think, is the number one. There is a beautiful book called The Trust Factor. I think I have it as well somewhere here. I don't remember the author. The Trust Factor, which is, to me, very interesting reading, actually, for building trust in an organization, and how trust, as I said earlier, can make an impact on your company culture and building high performance. So that is a great book. Another book, which is, to me, fantastic. Actually, there are two books from the same author. It's Patrick Lencioni. And Patrick Lencioni is a psychologist, as far as I remember, but he's a great author. He wrote two books, and one is called The 5 Temptations of a CEO, and the other one is called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. So he wrote two books, one from a leadership standpoint, and the other one from a team standpoint. And they came out with 5 different ideas for both. They're super important to be more effective. And these are two incredible books that I always recommend to my clients. But then there are many other books. I mean, I read one book per week. So there are many, but I think on the leadership side, these are my favorite right now. And as well, to go back to your point about emotional intelligence, I think there's something that we also need to clarify here is, the IQ, right? So the international quotient is by far overrated. And the EQ, so the emotional intelligence, is much underrated. So sometimes we We also hire people looking only on the IQ side, but we disregard the EQ side. And that's, as you know, as well in the work that you do, that is a kind of detrimental for the future.
Yeah, if we can find a way to have the balance, it's
exactly.
But I would always hire, I think, for most roles on the EQ side first. You can have a number of candidates that match the IQ you're looking for, if you like, for the more competency side. But then which one really fits best on EQ or say culture, etc. side, for sure. So we've spoken about trust, empathy, EQ, consistency, which I think are all fantastic leadership qualities. My next question for you is, you've obviously been through a journey yourself. You don't just wake up one day, I'm a leader, and that argument of, is a manager a leader? Absolutely not. You can be given a management job title, you have to earn the leadership and one. You've been on your own journey. What has your biggest challenge been when it's come to leadership? And I would love to hear from a sales point of view as well. Obviously, it's a sales podcast, but we can dig into both.
Right. So the challenge for building my own leadership during my career, and then from a sales perspective, yes, right. So let me see. So the challenge probably that I had was there are different. So one challenge that I really had, I always work with people that are older than me, and that's quite typical in my industry, by the way, right? So. And that was challenging because influence people that are older than you could be really challenging, especially if you are still kind of at the beginning of your career. And I think that has been one of the major challenges. But then you need to face it, but also you need to step up as a person. You need to, besides the title and the role, you really need to build the level of confidence yourself, by the way. So, and there are many different ways. And that's actually very, very practical and important for the sales role, confidence, stepping up and protecting your status. Now, when I say status, I don't mean ego. So two different things, right? So ego is something that we don't want. Actually, we want to leave at the door, although it might be useful in specific circumstances. But status is how you come across as an individual, your credibility, your, again, consistency in the way how you do things. So that's the status to some extent. So my challenge is being really turning from be a good follower and turning into leader by changing my status. But the only way to change my status was not by directing people to do things, but my learning has been really using what we said before, the empathy, emotional intelligence to really mobilize people, to make sure that although they were older than me, they follow me. And I think what I really learned was one specific thing happened actually just probably a couple of years at the beginning of my career when I led actually my first team. And they were all people from different countries on board of a drilling rig, of a vessel. And the younger probably was 35, 38. At the time, I think it was 28 myself. And so I said, if I'm going to step in and say, I'm the manager, please just listen, don't even argue, I could have failed incredibly, and probably even my career might probably turn into a mess. But what happened is I really learned to touch the right chords, to understand exactly what was the right word to say in the right time. But to be fair, Sarah, I think the big lesson has been turning into a fantastic active listener. What I think I'm right now, because really it's my job is listening people, but listening in a way that help them to move to the next step and not just listen just for the sake of listening. So if there is one suggestion I would like to give, is absolutely this. And again, it's fantastic, as you know, better than me from a sales perspective, right? The ability to listen more instead of pitching, say me, I, or we. The ability to really listen, because when you listen, you really understand what's going on in someone else's world, right? And that's, for me, these are the big lessons that I applied through my career, but also when I led the sales team. Yeah, also the humility, I suppose, the humility to be one of your salespeople to some extent, when was necessary, you know, by listening more, understanding really the challenge rather than just chasing the performance. Say, you know what, you didn't hit the quota, you're a fail or something like that. I've never done this before. So what I've done really was, you know what, tell me what's your problem. Tell me what is really the challenge. So why you think things are not working your way, and follow them, empowering. So that's really what I think a leader, a sales leader, by the way, should do with their people. But you have as well incredible experience on that. So I'm sure that you agree probably on these points.
And just touching on active listening there, I think it's a really interesting one, and one that I'm sure we both have a lot of conversations about. Do you believe that people can learn to act? You know, so some of the salespeople we come across and sales leaders that are just not listening, and we understand that, you know, you can give people the great questions. You know, you can almost give them a script of great questions to ask. But if they don't pause and they don't really listen, they are not going to get the information, you know, that they need to understand what that client is going through, what their challenges are, you know, to qualify, but over to, you know, understand how to overcome some of the objections that are going to happen later. Maybe you're not even the right fit for this company. You know, a lot of that is going to come through, obviously, from a sales point of view. But if you're a sales leader and you're asking questions, for example, around motivation of your sales team, but then you're not really listening, and you're just listening to words, you know, it's something that I feel like I learned to do at a very young age when I was nursing. If you think about pain, for example, sometimes we would ask somebody, are you in pain? And they would say, no, I'm okay. But so that was the words, that was the verbal. But then you could tell by the body language, how they were holding themselves, just if you really got to know them and understand them, you could tell when they just weren't being themselves as well. And often people were saying no because they didn't want to be a bother, you know, instead, especially, you know, little old ladies that were, you know, didn't want to be a bother. So they would just deal with it for as long as they could. It was my job to actively listen and act on everything that I was getting, all of those signals, not just the word no. And I can't remember if that's something that came naturally to me or if it was something I really had to learn to do to that level, if that makes sense. So after all the training you have had and the experience, I'm really keen to understand whether you believe active listening is something that everyone, some of us, can learn that don't already have it.
No, the good news is 100% possible to become a fantastic listener, 100%. The problem, though, is a behavior. Mm. So it's a habit. So changing behavior takes time. You need to first, you know, build self-awareness. So because, you know, if there is someone else telling you that you're not listening, you probably won't bother much. But if you realize yourself first, that is actually applies to everything, right? In everything that our feeling, our emotions. So we need first to realize that we have a problem to some extent. And that is the starting point. And then working either, you know, on your own, or maybe working with a coach or with a mentor, whatever, that really help you. But it's a behavior and it can be changed, can be absolutely changed. It's not very complicated, by the way, but as many other behaviors, it takes time to change it. But you need to consistently do that. And I think that the sales people, they have an incredible opportunity comparing to many other people that want to change their behaviors. They have a constant feedback, or at least they have an opportunity to have a constant or frequent feedback. Because, you know, if you get a client super happy with you, etc., or, you know, in a paycheck or sign a contract, you probably realize that your ability to change that behavior is improving. Or vice versa. If you see people that are not getting back to you, they're not even responding, there's something maybe wrong anyway. So there is a chance for salespeople to have this frequent feedback. However, is a behavior. So as any other type of behavior, you need to change the conditions why the behaviors applies. But when you do it, you can absolutely change it. But I have a suggestion, always give 5 or 6 seconds. You made a very great point about interrupting, for example.
Yeah.
We should never interrupt people. And but in order to avoid this, the easiest things to do, and that's actually is perfect with client conversation, always give 3 or 4 seconds to their person once she finish or he finish to talk, to see whether there is something else that he or she can want potentially to add. Because there's always something at the end that we are missing just because we go back to answering. And that is simple behavior, at least on paper, but that's something simple that you can start implementing right now.
Yeah, and it is something that many people, including myself, over the years, have had to really be aware of. Especially if I'm excited and passionate about something, someone's talking and you might want to, add something into that conversation. It's just trying to slow it down, because some people can communicate like that. Like myself and my mum, when we're together, we can almost talk over the top of each other and at the same time. It's bizarre, but for my husband, for example, he probably out of anyone would say, she's not listening to me. Compared to, as I laughed and you said it was a behaviors thing, you can choose to switch it on and off once you know what you're doing. And I agree, I don't always fully listen to my husband.
Well, one thing is not listening because you don't want to. One other thing is not listening because you can't and because you don't have that behavior.
Exactly. If you're choosing or if you're just never listening. But I think there's some personality traits coming into it as well, because there's certain people I can be around where people are almost interrupting each other, but they're still communicating. People are still really listening and maybe just getting excited about a conversation together. And when the passion starts to come out, this interrupting of pattern happens a bit more. But with other people, if you do that with them, they're going to freak out because they don't, and it affects trust. You start to get to them because they feel like it's disrespectful, or they feel like you're not listening to them, even maybe if you are. So I think it's that mirroring piece, isn't it? It's about really understanding who you're having a conversation with, and therefore which behaviors and traits, can you kind of bring up or tone down depending on the situation. And it's learning to be self-aware, isn't it, of what your own bad habits and traits and behaviors can be for some people, and then understanding when that's acceptable and when it's not. And I think until you have the self-awareness of what they are and an awareness of others, you can't piece the two together. So it's not a quick fix. And I'm sure you've coached many people that are still very much battling with that journey.
But you're right. You won't change. At the end of the day, you're not going to make any change if you don't accept it first yourself. So that's why many organizations do, and I do as well, in a call I call it verbal 360, which is not really a typical 360 the organization do, complicated HR stuff. It's really just asking to 10, 15 people that know very well the person I'm coaching, for example, what are the things they like about this person? What are the things that can be improved? And that's always is an eye-opening, as you can imagine, Sarah, because you finally realize that your perception to the same question, the perception that you have about yourself is often very different the perception people have on you. And you need to fill that gap. But the only way is actually asking. So it requires a lot of vulnerability, by the way, because people they don't necessarily like not judged, because it's not judgment, but getting a feedback, what is the things I do well? That's fine. What are the things I can do better? Yeah, but you know what? Thanks, but no thanks. I'm not interested in the answer. But unfortunately, you need to be open and vulnerable enough to get the feedback, because that's going to be a game changing. Because all the time, I can tell you there is at least 50% misalignment between what the people perceived and what other people perceived about them. So 50% is a lot. Because at the end of the day, yes, it's important what we think about ourselves, but the external validation is equally important, because otherwise you're not making any changes, because you want that kind of a proof that making a change is important. But if you don't get the other someone else's perception, are you going to make the change? Yes, but not always. So,
and for people to be asked those questions, to provide honest feedback,
of course,
in a work professional setting, surely creation of psychological safety first.
Absolutely.
Really important as leaders, because it's all well and good. Again, we can ask the question, but if they don't really believe that we're going to listen to their answers or take them on board, or that it's safe, then they're not going to give that feedback. So for us to benefit from what you've just said, which I think is great, and I think it's something that more leaders should be doing on a regular basis, myself included, I do think first, you can't just jump into that unless you've created this safe environment first for your team.
It's culture. I call it, so you're right, it's absolutely psychological safety. But in order to get psychological safety, what you have to do is actually having a culture that promotes psychological safety. So in other words, when people, they feel, happy to contribute, to open up, to say exactly what they think. So that is back to the culture, if you think about. So if you see, we're still talking about the same things, but from a different angle. So now we are coming back to the trust elements. So that's why trust is important to build high performance communication, culture, for that specific reason. So it's a very interesting topic.
And one last question.
Yes.
So currently working with a number of very fast growing businesses, and I'm sure a number of the CEOs will be listening to this, so I'll throw it in there. As if you're a leader of quite an SME, small organization, and then you get to the first 100, the first 200, the first 500, heading towards 1,000 employees, that culture, that environment is changing constantly. People in, people out, clients in, clients out. It's just forever changing and adapting. How do these leaders, work with that? When you've maybe once upon a time been 2 people and you're now 800 or 1,800, how does that work?
It's a great question, Sarah. You're asking great questions. So right. So let's start with the very quick definition about culture. So what culture is really is the summary of the norms and behaviors. They are either written, but most of the time there are things that are not written at all, but they're implied into an organization. So these are the things, the behaviors, they are either promoted in the organization or reinforced, right? So the challenge that you have when you're growing as organizations is not necessarily the fact that you're going to hire international people, because if you have an organizational culture, people, they're going to adapt anyway. Now, the challenge you have is not actually having these behaviors very well defined. No, I'm not talking about core values, because the core values are values, the behaviors are a consequence of the values, if you think about. But not having these behaviors very well defined is actually the beginning of your failure as an organization, because at that point, you're going to allow essentially every single individual in an organization, but also could be clients, define your own behaviors. So in other words, if you're accepting that someone is going to behave different than what are your current behaviors, by accepting this, essentially you are enforcing that behavior. And by reinforcing that behavior, you lose completely your credibility actually in the organization. Because again, people, they see you first behaving in one way, and then they start asking, so why the leader now is starting to behave in a different way? Or why other people now they're allowed to behave in a different way? So consistency now is super important, but it's also the starting point is really having this very well-defined behaviors. What is you're going to accept and approve, and what you are not going to approve at all. And unfortunately, this is a conversation that I'm having quite often, because think about how many times, Sarah, we have a new leadership team coming, especially in an organization that are growing. So there's a new CEOs, new leadership team, and they're coming and they say, oh, you know what, I don't like this culture, which is possible. And maybe is a good reason to change it, because if it's not high-performing culture, probably it's a good time to change it. But it takes a lot of time changing the culture, because you need to go through the old process, changing the behaviors first, you as a leader, then going to the next level, to the first line, second line. Once they change the behavior too, then you go to the second line, to the third line, etc., etc. It's like a chocolate, you know, the wedding multi-layer chocolate fountain. Okay, so that's kind of the thing. You start from the top and then it goes down on every single level, and that's how culture works. So it's a tough work, but you have to do it once in a time. Sometimes leaders wait too long until they grow and say, oh gosh, we need to set up our behavior because we are growing too fast. My suggestion is define your behaviors when you're still a small organization, because that will be easier to reinforcing other people to understand what they are.
That's great. And it's something that I can, worry about all the time, because as you know, we're a small organization and we've created a lovely little culture, with our little team. But I would say every sort of 2 people you add in, it can change, and it kind of feels like it needs to be pulled back. And so I can't even imagine, recruiting 100 people within 2 months and trying to manage that, with all these different behaviors and personalities and those that's coming into an organization. So it must be a big challenge, and it'll certainly keep you in a job.
It's a very strategic conversation to have about behaviors. So my suggestion is really don't wait until it's too long, or when you start growing, because it's actually better defining what you really want as a behavior in organization, because that will be easier to communicate it properly for the new hires.
Absolutely. So I'm aware of time. Honestly, we could just talk all day.
Of course, as always, you and me.
So many great topics here, from, really what makes great leadership to, motivating a team so that they perform, increasing the dopamine as part of that motivation, trust, consistency, emotional intelligence, succession. We've covered so many great topics around leadership. So thank you so much for spending time with me today. And I will put your link to your LinkedIn and some of the books that we mentioned as well into the show notes, so that the listeners can find those easily. But what's next for you, Andrea, to finish us off? What's next? What's coming up? And where can people keep an eye on your journey?
Well, so as everyone, wants to, clearly I want to expand, my business growing. And I think for me, there is a big opportunity, because what I said, this level of uncertainty is increasing. And I believe there is an element of be ready to manage and lead all these changes happening across industry. It's not just in my own industry. So uncertainty requires change. We are, as individuals, we are not hardwired for change, because that's not work in our brain. So I think there are some clear concern of making changes as a leader in our organization and growing organization in these very complex and challenging moments. So for me, my goal is really helping organization, their leaders, to go through this process in a safe way and still become very successful leaders. But more importantly, I suppose, is actually building new leaders, so empowering new leaders, so helping the current leaders to empower new leaders so they can create really a long-lasting legacy for the organization. That's what it's all about.
And where's the easiest place for people to find you if they want to reach out?
Yeah, sure. They can reach out to my LinkedIn profile. So I'm very active. I'm posting a lot. So I love talking about this stuff. I have my own website, which is www.andreapetrone.com. And I'm active as well on other social media, not only Clubhouse, but also quite frequent on Twitter, which is one of my favorite places. And also my email, if you want to reach out directly. So it's andrea@andreapetrone.com.
Perfect. I was going to say, if anyone's on Clubhouse, make sure that you follow Andrea, because that's obviously where we met. And I'm sure that we will be doing more rooms together within the platform, having more conversations like this one.
Just looking forward to it.
Great. Well, thank you again so much for your time. Thanks to everyone for listening. Please check out the show notes and get in touch with Andrea if he can help you with anything, or you just want to follow his journey, which is a really exciting one ahead. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Sales Insights with Sarah podcast. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already so that you are notified of every new episode. If you could take a few minutes to leave a review, it would be greatly appreciated. See you next time.